Hey guys, what's up? Today I'll be ranking every Suikoden game from easiest to hardest. And when I say every, I mean every single one of them, even the spin-offs, and even that one game that never came out of Japan. So let's begin! We are going to start with that Suikoden game on the PSP called Woven Web of the Century. For the longest time this was a Japanese exclusive and the last Suikoden ever created. Well, it still is a Japanese exclusive, but last year it was finally fan translated and the team did an amazing job with the translation. Is this game any good? Yes, it definitely is, but as you can see, it is the easiest of them all. Perhaps they made it this easy so people could get into the series more, well, easily. The game's great, like I said, but it stayed in Japan to mixed reviews. One, it doesn't have any war battles or duels, and two, sometimes making a game too hard can be a bad thing, but sometimes making it too easy can also be just as bad. However, I don't think the difficulty made this game bad by any means, at least not in my opinion. It's so easy because a lot of the skills you learn here are either broken, doing a lot of damage, or they are area of effect attacks at the cost of barely anything. You need to inflict or receive damage so your points go up in order to be able to use these skills. But you get to a point in the game real quick, by the way, where most of the time some characters can already use them at the start of battle. Magic is limited here, so most of your mages or healers will have a hard time at the beginning. However, you can recruit characters early that make magic stones for them from materials that are so easy to find, or very cheap in most of the stores out there. So what I'm trying to say is that for the first few hours the game's challenge will be moderate, but it's so easy to exploit quite early. Still, I strongly recommend this game to Suikoden fans, but only if the difficulty doesn't bother you. Next up is Suikoden Tearcress. Before Suikoden on PSP there was this other spin-off on the DS, we did get this one. It was the first time Konami experimented with spin-offs on different systems, Nintendo being one of them. Again, no war battles and no duels, so it was a regular turn-based RPG like the previous game, except in both, you can still recruit the 108 Stars of Destiny, about half of them being playable characters. Now, Tearcress isn't as easy as Suikoden PSP, but it isn't hard either, at least not most of the time. Sure, there are some boss battles that are quite challenging, obviously the final boss being one of them, but the majority are alright. You can beat them without any grinding whatsoever. Thing is, your party here is reduced to only 4 active members in battle, unlike most other Suikoden games out there. That's not really an issue when 1 or 2 characters can cheese these battles and the others act as support. Eventually, however, you start getting more powerful allies and some of them can be slightly broken but not too much, so you still have a fairly challenging game with well-rounded mechanics to keep the difficulty at average. Next is Suikoden 4. Many will say this is the easiest Suikoden, perhaps because they haven't played the previous 2 games. It's not a hard game, it's just like in Tearcress where most of the time the difficulty is alright. I think sometimes the difficulty in this series comes mostly from the duels, as they are unpredictable. You have to guess what your opponent will do by what they're saying. They can be very cryptic sometimes and therefore, like I said, unpredictable. Losing means it's game over, and if you're under-leveled, even getting most of the choices right will still take its toll on you. Well, I feel most duels are not too hard to predict here, and you can always try again by memorizing the patterns. Once again, you have a party of 4, so that means less manpower, but faster battles. A lot of characters can have dual attacks, creating combos that can do massive damage to most enemies. I only found a few bosses that gave me trouble, but to be honest, I can't remember a single one that frustrated me or something, or someone that I lost to several times. I think the sea battles can be quite tough sometimes though, that's where I found the most trouble here. Ships utilize elemental strengths and weaknesses, so not getting the right ship against the enemy will probably be a disaster. You only have a limited amount of ships to deploy, all adapted to the characters you assign as the commanders, and their elements of course. In Suikoden, a few characters have permadeath, so if they die, they're gone forever. That means resetting the battle for most people. Don't worry, Suikoden 4 is not among the hardest in my opinion, but I'd recommend not underestimating it anyway. Moving on to the first Suikoden. It's a good time to say that there isn't much of a difference in difficulty between this game and the previous two. I also found the challenge to be average, pretty balanced for the most part. I found some hard bosses here and there, and often mere luck will be a factor to survive them, but it was mostly knowing what runes to use or which characters. Thanks to the auto battle feature in these games, grinding is so easy and satisfying, especially near the end. Duels are once again kinda cryptic like in Suikoden 4, and I'm sure most of you remember this one, a duel you have to win if you wanna keep this character alive for recruitment. But just like in Suikoden 4, I found the war battles giving me the most trouble. The system got more creative and innovative on every Suikoden game. This one felt like a beta prototype of it, which was still very fun. But it's a basic rock paper scissors mechanic that also relies a lot on luck. You have some characters to try and guess which move the enemy will do next, but it doesn't work all the time. So every now and then, it'll be a risk of a guessing game and you can only win by mere chance. This is why I found these games slightly harder than the previous two games in the video. They didn't make it too hard though, so I've been able to get away most of the time with barely any casualties on every playthrough. I only saw the game over screen a couple of times, so I think the developers knew that they had limited options with this battle system, decreasing the chances of enemies screwing you over and over again. Next up is Suikoden 2. I think Suikoden 2 is slightly harder than 1 for simple reasons. Not the duels, not the war battles, both are pretty balanced with a few events here and there that make them kinda tough. Duels are the most balanced, but there's a couple of really hard war battles. Most of you who play this game clearly remember the one where you need to keep Ridley alive for a few turns. A battle that once again plays a lot on the luck factor, with even the best strategies not being a guarantee for his survival. But anyway, I think a few bosses in this game are what makes the difference in difficulty as opposed to the first Suikoden. Neglor, for example, can be pretty nasty with his massive area of effect attacks. In fact, I think that's usually the biggest shenanigan for most bosses, not only in Suikoden but in JRPGs in general. Tough bosses that do massive damage to the party. I love them. And if you run out of ways to heal the whole party at once, things get really tough. Others aren't so hard to take down, like the Rock Golem for example, but the Bone Dragon can be quite nasty, although by this point I had great healers and tons of users for the runes. Suikoden 2 is not really what I will call a tough game, just a game with a few tough bosses and war battles, that's all. Moving on to Suikoden Tactics. This is a strategy RPG that acts as both a prequel and a sequel to Suikoden 4, but it's mostly a sequel. It's worth playing for sure, but not if you're not into strategy RPGs. Obviously, most tactical games are hard, everybody knows that. Suikoden Tactics is nowhere near among the hardest, but it can get quite tough. I mentioned before that in most Suikoden games, some characters have permadeath, namely the ones that are not indispensable to the plot. This is the very first Suikoden game I ever played, and I remember losing a couple of characters forever. Thing is, combat relies a lot in elemental stuff, just like its counterpart Suikoden 4. This game's far more challenging than it though, because you have more characters to worry about, and less ways to revive them. Healing is also usually a problem here, at least during the first several hours of the game. Another issue is that most enemies are kinda bulky in HP, so taking them down with regular attacks or weak elemental magic takes a while. I don't think some of the maps, especially the ones with rune cannons, were very well designed. They aren't poorly programmed, don't worry, it's just that sometimes everything felt at your complete disadvantage. But like I said, the game's manageable, I don't think I lost more than a couple of times. It's challenging, but not really that hard. Coming right up, Suikoden 5. This is my favorite game in the series. For the most part, it felt like the right challenge for me back then in all of its 3 battle mechanics, except all 3 felt harder than most Suikoden games. You're back with 6 party members and you can use different formations to increase your advantage with some bosses. Like in Suikoden 2, there's only a few boss battles that can be kinda painful, but they're manageable, although the wrong party and formation can be disastrous against most bosses at the end of the game. Final boss is brutal here. I think it's the hardest in the series, but that's just me and I won't spoil it for you. Duels and war battles were the toughest here. Duels, for instance, give you a timer to decide quickly which action you'll use against your opponent. No other Suikoden game has this feature and you could always take your time analyzing what your enemy was saying. Here you feel that pressure and you can often make a mistake thanks to it. War battles, I freaking love them, but they can take forever since platoons and ships of all kind move slowly. And all of this in real time, like in a real-time strategy RPG. However, what makes them hard is the lack of force power of some units against others, even if their triangle rule is stronger. By triangle rule I mean the usual rock, paper, scissors. No matter the result of one encounter, the losing team will retreat, and they can sometimes retreat to where the stronger enemies are, which can be quite troublesome. But that's what makes this game so engaging to me and so good. Even if it's annoying, being unpredictable makes you want to try things in a different way every time. But yeah, this game's hard and can be frustrating sometimes. And finally, the hardest is Suikoden 3. I'll leave out the duels here since I don't remember one giving me a lot of trouble. They aren't easy though, but they're mostly manageable. It's the war battles and some major bosses that makes this one the hardest. In war, you have one of your characters as a commander of a small platoon of generic soldiers. The battles are turn-based but completely out of your control. That's what makes them so hard, because instead of ganging up on the leader to end the battle quickly or taking out the annoying soldiers first, everyone attacks whoever the RNG wants. Often they have zero strategy and get killed, even if they overpower the enemy. I love this game with a passion, but this war battle system is the worst in the series. Now let's talk about the bosses here. Most of them are balanced. Remember that your party works in pairs here in this particular game. You can't control all 6 of them, only 3. The second character of each pair will do whatever it wants. Well, it's like in Persona 3. Most of them do intelligent things most of the time, but they can sometimes mess it up badly. But even if you could control them all, there's nothing saving you from guys like this monster. Legendary, and perhaps the hardest boss in the game. You need to take down each of his heads if you want to have a better chance, because they do nasty attacks and one of them heals the main body. Another extremely messed up battle is on Chris's side when she and a bunch of under-leveled and underpowered party members fight against the 4 main antagonists at once. Other bosses are much later in this game, just as brutal or more. This is the only Suikoden in the entire series that is hard, like really hard. In my experience, after beating most of them several times, it puts Suikoden 5 to shame any day. Not amongst the hardest RPGs on the PS2, but definitely the hardest Suikoden game ever made. Isn't it funny how some Suikoden games are harder than others, but because of its war battles or its duels or its boss battles, you know, they're all kind of different, and I think that's what makes them so interesting. That's what makes this series so special to me. One of the many things, of course. Anyway, thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends. See you next time!